Right.
Without further ado.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Good to be here. So the past month or so, eyes have been on Texas, on Florida, on Puerto Rico, other states that have been badly hit by storms and hurricanes. I want to take you back to Superstorm Sandy, another big natural disaster. October 2012, damage of $75 billion, 233 people were killed. The Rockefeller Foundation offices, and I had just been there 3 months at the time, 2 months. Offices were closed for a week. We were in the SoCo area, south of Power. Colleagues were scattered across the region. I had someone on my team who was trying to bail out her flooded basement in Hoboken. And at this point, the Rockefeller Foundation had been working on resilience for about 8 years, very involved in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, helping to rebuild, and making investments in several cities in Asia that were dealing with the impacts of rising sea levels. But Sandy was really a pivotal moment, I think, that opened the eyes of the staff and the board to mobilize around this issue of responding to crises and natural disasters. I think because it hit home here in New York in our headquarters, it really had that impact. And it also answered the centennial question. We were in 2012 looking ahead to 2013, which was the 100-year anniversary of the establishment of the foundation. And we were asking ourselves at that point in 2012, how could we use that milestone not just as a chance to reflect back on the foundation's history, but also as a way to launch new work and look forward? And resilience really resonated as the answer to that question. The idea that we needed to galvanize and help communities prepare for the reality that crisis is the new normal. And the potential to really be the 21st century equivalent of Rockefeller Foundation's 20th century work on the Green Revolution, building a new field that could positively impact millions, perhaps even billions of people. So when I left the Rockefeller Foundation in August after 5 years, I think we were well on our way to achieving those goals. By that point, Rockefeller had invested about $500 million in resilience over 10 to 12 years, and with that had leveraged about $25 billion in investments from governments and the private sector. And I'll talk a little bit more about how we were able to do that. Scores of cities now have a chief resilience officer, a new role changing the way that they prepare for disasters. Many mayors have pledged 10% of their budgets to addressing resilience. And I think in the current era of the federal government, that focus on mayors and cities perhaps looks even more important than it was when we engaged on it 5 years ago. So today I wanted to share with you a bit about how this work and these grant funds were magnified through the use of influence and communications, and how we were able to have significantly more impact through adding on those communications and influence approaches. So first, let me pause and just explain two concepts here, influence and resilience. So first of all, what do I mean by influence? So when aspiring to create change, I think most foundations consider the scale of the potential impact that they can have through the lens of their financial health and their endowment, how much money they have in the bank. And obviously that's a good place to start, but if it's the only place that a foundation looks, I believe they're missing a big opportunity. That's because there's another endowment that they should be considering, their influence endowment. And so what is that? Well, it's the organization's brand capital. It's comprised of their name, their reputation, their networks, their connections, their convening power. And you don't have to have a financial endowment in order to have an influence endowment. It certainly helps. But for those philanthropies that have a financial endowment, the influence endowment really allows them to magnify the impact of their grant making. And that's what we were able to do at Rockefeller. And then second, what do I mean by resilience? Well, as I said earlier, today crisis really seems to be the new normal. Disruptions are coming faster, staying longer, exacerbated by dynamics like globalization, climate change, urbanization. It seems like really not a month or perhaps even a week goes by when there isn't a disturbance, a cyber attack, a new viral strain, an economic blow, wildfires, or a deadly storm. And so Rockefeller defined resilience as helping communities better prepare for, respond to, and transform from disruption. More simply put, those of us in the communications department, it's what really enables people to survive, adapt, and thrive. And so what I want to do this evening is to share 5 examples of how Rockefeller leveraged its communications, its influence endowment, to help build this field of resilience. So I'll talk about this network of 100 cities, a book, The Resilience Dividend, partnerships with media, including The Guardian, a competition to spur resilient design, and a virtual reality film. So let me start with 100 Resilient Cities. This is a global network funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, and cities across the globe are selected through 3 rounds of competitions which took place over 3 years. The cities are funded, and I'm just going to go through a few of the cities in the network, and I'll put up the complete list later. But cities in the network are funded to give them 4 key tools. The first is funding for this Chief Resilience Officer, who works with the mayor across sectors and leads the city's resilience building process. The second is support to develop a resilience strategy, so a plan for how the city is going to be more resilient going forward. And then third, once the Chief Resilience Officers help develop that strategy, access to a platform of partners from the private, public, and NGO sectors who have agreed to provide pro bono services to the cities to help them implement the resilience strategy. And then fourth, they're all members of a network of the 100 cities. They can learn from each other, help each other out, share ideas. So one example of where this has already had some very beneficial impact for a city is Norfolk, Virginia, on the Atlantic coast, home to the Navy's Atlantic Fleet, faces severe storms and regular flooding. And Norfolk was in the first round of the competition. They've used all 4 of those tools. And in 2015, the ratings giant Moody's credited Rockefeller's work in Norfolk in helping the region to maintain its credit rating in the face of these storms and flooding. If the credit rating had been downgraded, the cost of borrowing for the city for projects would have gone up. So 100 Resilient Cities is unusual for a philanthropy program in that it was designed through a communications lens, and that's why I wanted to use it as one of the examples this evening. So we wanted to use the launch of the competition to really drive attention to the issue of resilience, given this decision to really focus on it, and also, of course, encourage cities to apply to the competition and therefore the network. So we launched on Rockefeller Foundation's actual 100th birthday. I mentioned the connection to the centennial. We put up $100 million for 100 cities. So this was making it easy for the media to grasp the concept here. We had a very successful announcement. What was a little challenging was because we were racing to meet that deadline and take advantage of that opportunity of the birthday, we didn't actually have these 4 supports for the cities set up yet. So this was a risk for sure, but we knew that we needed to leverage that moment of our centennial. And in fact, what happened was it became a powerful driver. It built excitement around this. It raised our ambition. And I believe that if we had built this program in a more traditional foundation way, we would probably have found ourselves with the 5 Resilient Cities pilot program rather than the 100 Resilient Cities effort. And so communications was very key at the start. It's also been important to the ongoing success of the initiative, partly because we designed it with multiple touch points that are very media friendly in the process. So let me give you the example of New Orleans to demonstrate this. So of course, first of all, each city is selected. They're part of a big announcement, which is a global announcement, but there's also obviously attention and focus in the city when they're selected. Why is our city being chosen for this? What is resilience? Why are we engaged in this? Then each city has a strategy workshop where community members, advocates, representatives of various sectors are brought together. And again, this is another opportunity for media attention and to engage the community. Then each city selects their chief resilience officer. This is another opportunity to engage media, engage conversation. This is the New Orleans chief resilience officer on the left, Jeff Ebert. The mayor of New Orleans, Mitch Landrieu, Judy Roden, the former president of the Rockefeller Foundation, and Michael Berkowitz, who heads up 100 Resilient Cities. So similar announcements in each of the cities in the 100. And then I mentioned this, the strategy that the cities are developing. So another moment is when the strategy is officially announced and shared. This is the New Orleans Resilience Strategy release, which took place on the 10th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina, so President Obama was in town. Now, obviously, not every strategy release had the President of the United States present, and these days probably not many or any will. But in each city, it was an opportunity to really engage in dialogue around what the city should be doing and what resilience meant. We also got good interest kind of beyond the cities themselves, particularly in this new role of Chief Resilience Officer. This is a Fast Company story about what CROs are and what they're doing. And then I mentioned these private sector partners who are providing free services to the cities through this platform. Well, they also have an interest in promoting 100 resilient cities. And not just the corporate social responsibility or CSR department, but also, and particularly the business units who see real value to partnering with cities across the world. And some of them, out of this effort, have formed new business relationships and opportunities with each other. So, for example, Swiss Re, the big insurance giant, and Veolia, who's a big construction multinational firm, through 100 Resilient Cities have put together a partnership which basically allows for, if a city is hit by a storm or another disaster, for Veolia to start work doing the repairs earlier than they otherwise would be. I'm sure many of you know from your personal lives, waiting for the insurance check to arrive can take a while, and it's actually the same with cities responding to disasters, and this jump starts that process. So this was the announcement of that. And then digital. We really engaged through social media and digital tools to take the message beyond the 100 cities in the network. And a proof point for this is that we have seen cities and states that are not funded by Rockefeller, that aren't in the 100 group, hiring their own chief resilience officers with their own money, seeing the value of being part of this. So now where we are is 100 cities selected. That map doesn't come up very well. There's the list of the cities. So 100 cities have been selected, including New York, representing 47 countries across 6 continents. And what we have is a core group of leaders who can be models for other cities in their countries and globally to really build an urban resilience movement. 33 cities have released and are implementing their strategies. Many have formalized the Chief Resilience Officer role and are continuing to fund it after the 2-year funding that Rockefeller provided. And as I mentioned, cities that aren't in the network are also recruiting and hiring Chief Resilience Officers. And then $500 million worth of services are being provided to the cities by the companies and nonprofits that are on the platform. So let me just let you hear a little bit from the mayors themselves as to the importance of this and what it's meaning for their cities. So I have this video to share to do that. This was from the Urban Resilience Summit in July.
I was listening to the 4 mayors this morning from around the world, different continents, but all the issues that they raise are similar in all cities around the world. Maybe the scale might differ, but it's the same issues. Resilience issues for us, of course, is climate change, the stresses and the shock of climate change. We currently experience our worst drought in 100 years. We've got less than 12% drinkable water left in our dams.
Well, what we found wasn't something that we expected when we started. You know, when thinking about resiliency, you think primarily about the environment and how you are able in a city like this to deal with flooding and landslides and potential heavy storms that seem to be occurring more and more with climate change. What we found our biggest issue was equity and how to be able to bridge the divide between an economy that is booming and those that are being left behind.
Everyone knows after Paris and Brussels how vulnerable social connections in cities can be. So we have run for a couple of years now in Rotterdam a program that I call the We Community, that is meant to bring all these people together, 174 nationalities, to win the hearts and minds of people, to be one society. Resiliency has different approaches. It's cyber, it's water, it's hurricanes, but also social dimensions.
I think all over the world, we're living a very deep confidence crisis in institutions, in politicians, in entrepreneurs. So I think you will never have a resilient city with the lack of trust that is needed to build these bonds. All the big problems of a city and of any community will require always a shared commitment from the authority, from the public sector, but also from communities and from the people.
So much of resilience is rethinking how we do things, being more holistic, and also more open to innovation. Every day, the people who live in my city are experiencing terrible and unnecessary stresses. And a city like Oakland is constantly subjected to shocks. We had one of the most deadly fires in American history. We're subject to earthquakes, to flooding, to sea level rise, as well as just the constant stresses of poverty and inequality. And so that is why we cannot wait.
We are all practical people, we are people of action, we are activists as mayors. Unlike our counterparts at our national level who can talk policy and you know, all kinds of ideas, but we are real practical people.
Cities is where it is going to happen. Cities are the places of innovation, but they also touch the most numbers of lives. And if we can get it right in one city, we can share those practices with other cities and literally lift up millions of people.
So part of why I wanted to share that was just to give you that sense of the breadth of the definition of resilience, which really is certainly about climate change and other natural disasters, but has that much broader social perspective. And I will be glad to come back and talk a bit more about that in the Q&A. But let me move on to the second intervention or example I wanted to talk about, which is a book, The Resilience Dividend, by Judith Rodin, who was the president of the Rockefeller Foundation at the time. Now, in an age of Twitter and Snapchat, a book may seem pretty old media, and yet books still have the power to frame debates, to influence behavior, and drive policy change. We use this book really as a communications tool to advance our resilience work in 3 ways. So first, it was a lever to open up invitations to get press coverage, join panels, land media interviews. It led to speaking invitations such as the US Conference of Mayors, the Royal Society of Arts. Reviews of the book ran in publications from the Wall Street Journal to the Stanford Social Innovation Review. And the media appearances and interviews ranged from MSNBC to the BBC, the Financial Times, the Chronicle of Philanthropy. Second, it was a platform to collect internal knowledge and stories from within the organization. So in conducting the research for the book, we went through nearly a decade of work on resilience at Rockefeller and its grantees and used that material as case studies for the book. And then we have all the case studies together in one place. Third, it was a driver to distill our argument. So it was the book writing that actually really framed the concept of a dividend. This idea that resilience investments don't just pay off when a community is hit by a disaster, but they also bring everyday benefits like jobs and social cohesion. So for example, in Hoboken, they are building a project which is a water catchment pool, which if and when Hoboken floods, the water can be retained there. But during the rest of the time, it's a parking garage underground, and then there's a park on top. So you have 3 benefits with 1 investment, and that's the type of example that we use to illustrate this idea of the dividend. And that new framing really ensured that the book was seen as a new contribution to this growing resilience movement that we were championing. The third intervention was media partnerships with the likes of The Guardian. So here we used grant dollars to fund media organizations to advance the conversation on resilience and influence key decision makers that this is a pressing 21st century priority. We chose The Guardian specifically for this because we wanted to reach political leaders in cities. So obviously we had the group within the 100 Resilient Cities Network, but this was a way to reach a much broader group of city leadership. We also worked with the New York Times on their Cities for Tomorrow conference. We partnered with public radio, including WNYC, and obviously, as I mentioned, The Guardian. So I would say 3 takeaways from this. First of all, we had to navigate the church-state divide. So the traditional sense within media organizations that advertising is on one side and news and editorial on the other. And that is certainly breaking down, but that's actually a barrier that we supported. And what we found was the answer to this was disclosure, which really worked well for everyone. So Rockefeller's funding is acknowledged, you see here on the left of the page, acknowledging us and associating us with urbanization and resilience, but all of the editorial planning and decisions were independent and firmly with The Guardian, both to uphold their principles of independent journalism, which certainly at The Guardian are very strongly held, but also to our benefit, we believed, ensuring that the platform was a trusted and credible source of news and analysis on cities. The result, metrics that everyone was pleased with. In the first 3 years of Guardian Cities, they had more than 35 million unique visitors and over 73 million page views, and Rockefeller re-upped for funding for another 3 years at the end of last year. The partnership also allowed The Guardian to pursue different types of journalism including more sort of solutions-focused journalism. So not just talking about the problems in cities, but also surfacing some of the ideas for how cities were responding. The funding enabled their journalists to dig much deeper into those types of stories than the restraints of a new deadline-driven newsroom would normally allow. So, for example, 2 series that they ran, which they never had the resources to do before. One was The Story of Cities, which charted the ancient historical roots of cities from Baghdad to Benin, and The History of Cities in 50 Buildings, which was a series over 50 days. And a lot of these, they got great traction on Instagram as well. And finally, it provided great content for the foundation. So getting program officers to write a blog post is not always the easiest thing to do. And here we had some of the best journalists in the world producing content, which we were able to feed back into our social channels, making them better and more compelling. Last year, Rockefeller launched Zilliant, which is a digital engagement platform focused on resilience, really trying to build a community of resilience practitioners. And for that, Thomson Reuters Foundation was the content partner producing news stories. That was another media partnership that we had. But Zilliant was also able to draw on the content from the Guardian Cities as well as other Rockefeller media grantees. So we were building really an ecosystem of good news and high quality information and stories on resilience. The fourth example is Rebuild by Design. And this was the one that was most directly connected to Sandy. And the story here is really about leverage. So Rockefeller partnered with the US Department of Housing and Urban Development, which was where I worked before Rockefeller, to ensure that $1 billion in Sandy recovery funds were spent to better protect communities from future storms rather than just building back exactly what had been there before. What Rockefeller did was make a $4 million investment to fund this competition, Rebuild by Design, with the goal of advancing these types of more resilient proposals. So teams of architects and designers and engineers worked with communities, had community meetings to create ideas. One of them was the dry line, or the big U, which will protect Lower Manhattan, but in a way that integrates with the community. So this would be on by the FDR with flood barriers, but also park and recreation space. Or this example, which is oyster beds off the coast of Staten Island in New York Harbor. The oysters actually reduce the storm surge. It's a really good way to also engage kids and teach them about the environment. The only caution is not to actually eat the oysters. So in 2014, 10 teams were named winners and were funded by HUD. Rebuild by Design was a smart use of both philanthropic and government dollars. The $4 million that the foundation put in meant that there was a smarter and more resilient deployment of the $1 billion that the federal government had to spend. So that's pretty good leverage. In 2013, CNN named Rebuild by Design among its Big 10 ideas of the year. And then in 2014, HUD took the idea beyond the New York region with a national resilience competition, providing an additional $1 billion for communities impacted by other disasters. Rockefeller spent a further $3 million to help with a series of resilience academies to help communities submit better and smarter applications. So again, $3 million in grant funding ensured another $1 billion was spent in a much smarter and more resilient way. But it's not just about the funding. To go back to my point about the influence endowment, the reputation and name that Rockefeller had built through our resilience work and our communications work ensured that the foundation was seen not just as a funder, but also as a source of knowledge and expertise. That increased the attendance and seniority level of officials at the academies, and we were able to therefore leverage our brand to have more impact. Now, of course, this type of collaboration was dependent on the perspective of the federal government, and clearly that has changed this year. But two things I would note on that. The first is, I think, once again, this emphasizes the importance of engaging with cities and mayors. And certainly at the city government level, there can be elections and change as well. But I think rarely in such a dramatic way as we see at the federal level. And then also the importance of engaging with the career staff at HUD and in the federal government, which was something that we did, because the political appointees come and go, but the career staff are able to take this work forward. And I'm happy to talk a bit more about that in the Q&A if you're interested. So the fifth example is a virtual reality film. The woman on the right, her name is Kusum. She lives in a small village in rural India, a few miles from the border with Nepal. And she has access to solar electricity through a Rockefeller-funded initiative that has allowed her to open a beauty salon named for her daughter, Shraddha. So this is a compelling story of women's empowerment, poverty alleviation, and how to help rural villages become more resilient, especially in an era of climate change. Rockefeller was looking to bring in other funders and the private sector to join the foundation's Smart Power initiative, which is how Kusum has her electricity, and bring these solar mini-grids to 1,000 villages in India. And 1,000 sounds like and is a lot, although in the context of India, this is a pilot program because there's 44,000 villages in India without reliable access to electricity. So meeting people like Kusum and hearing their stories can be a powerful piece of persuasion. But getting to Kusum's village, it's a 6-hour, a bumpy ride from Lucknow. And I know this because I did this in May when we filmed the VR piece. And so we saw VR as a solution to this. Rather than taking funders to the village, we would bring the village to the funders. We worked with Matter Unlimited. They had a team here in the US and also in India, shooting 8 scenes over a few days in the beauty shop with a farmer who now has a solar-powered pump for his fields, in a snack shop, a sewing shop, and a girls' school. So Power in Hand finished this summer, and we rolled it out to funders and partners during the Social Good Summit. And we'll be targeting conferences and events with energy investors and funders. Being VR, it doesn't make sense for me to show that as a video to you, but this is the URL. If you have a VR headset or Google Cardboard or want to go check it out, or even just to look at the 360 view, which you can do online. So, in conclusion, I would say that obviously Sandy did enormous damage, and we're seeing more storms doing more enormous damage. But out of it came a mindset change that was really a genesis for a much more ambitious reframing of Rockefeller's resilience work. And so let me leave you with sort of 4 lessons from the 5 examples that I've shared. So the first I would say is, don't be scared of government engagement. Governments deal in billions, not millions. So even philanthropy doesn't operate at that scale. So they are powerful partners. But of course, don't rely on government alone because they are subject to elections. For the private sector, I think it's important to make a business case. And we saw this, that it wasn't just about engaging the corporate social responsibility units. we had an impact with 100 resilient cities through talking to the business units, and now there's 70 platform partners engaged. Then third, I would say create what you need. We built a whole new nonprofit, 100 Resilient Cities, to run the challenge and support the cities. Created a new role in the cities, the Chief Resilience Officer, to really drive that engagement. And then fourth, I would recommend a mixture of old tools and new. So we had the book, but also digital tools, media partnerships, and the virtual reality film. So I mentioned at the beginning Rockefeller's $500 million in grant making for resilience, and the ability to leverage that to a further $25 billion in resilience investments. I have no doubt that the communications and influence tools that I outlined today were an important factor in helping us to be able to deliver that leverage. And so as you think about what you might want to pursue to achieve the greatest impact in addressing contemporary challenges, I certainly would urge you to take into those roles a consideration of the organization's influence endowment or influence capital in addition to the financial capital. Because I think we really need to do that in order to be able to meet the challenges, the scale of the challenges that we face. And I think communications tools can really help to magnify that impact. So with that, I will leave you with a way to connect with me, and happy to take any questions. Hi.
So in this work, it seems that communications was leading the work. How does something like this work or come about when communications is not leading the work?
Yeah.
Also the case then?
That's a very good question. I think I would say that we saw a couple of different models I gave examples of, and then specifically to your point, some that where communications was not in the driving seat. So I think 100 Resilient Cities is interesting because that was a case where it was really started by and driven by communications, and then from there turned into a fully fledged program. So I think the role that communications played there was actually to get it started, and then it became more of a traditional program. I think something like Rebuild by Design was a case where there was sort of programmatic and communications working very closely together, and both were very important in delivering on that. But there were certainly multiple other initiatives that Rockefeller was working on where communications was perhaps in more of a supporting role, although we certainly always made the case to try and bring communications in early. And we're able to really, I think, sort of use communications tools to then jump to the next thing or to help the next project be better. So I think a good example of that was, I mentioned some work in Asia, funding cities there. That was a program called the Asian Cities Climate Change Resilience Network. And as you could probably guess by the name, that didn't start as a communications initiative, but was doing great work, and some really compelling case studies coming out of the cities that that program was engaged with. And we were able to use those examples as proof points when we launched 100 Resilient Cities to show what the potential of this type of work can be. So I think that's where there's real value in having communications engaged throughout and helping to kind of draw out the lessons. And from a sort of an internal perspective, I think when communications can kind of demonstrate that sort of value to program staff, it then helps make the case for greater use of communications and influence tools going forward. Yeah.
You mentioned that the 100 Resilient Cities project was not exactly like the traditional foundation way. So I was wondering what kind of risk does it take to like build something like that, and how did you create a case for that?
So I think it really was the centennial that provided the opportunity to do that. I think there was, because we had a particular date and a particular desire to use that milestone, and so that drove us to work hard, do a lot of thinking, have something ready that was really credible to announce. And then, of course, having put ourselves on record by doing the announcement, the obligation to build. But I don't think you have to have a centennial in order to be able to take that kind of approach. I think having a deadline and making sort of a public commitment can be tools that you can use in other contexts. I actually think about this from my time in government, where things can also move slowly and deliberatively within government agencies, and sometimes the way to kind of jumpstart that was to have the commissioner or the secretary of the department to go out and give a speech and say, we're going to do this, and then the commitment is on the record, and the obligation is then on the department to make it so. Now, obviously, you want to be careful about how you're using that tactic, but I think if there's a program where you're sort of pretty sure you know what you're doing, but it's getting it over that final hurdle, that's when that can be a useful tool. Yes.
Yeah, in projects like this where communications obviously plays such a vital role, how do you facilitate just like internally, like the communication between the communications department and other departments to make sure that you're getting like the information that's accurate and people are doing what they're saying they're going to be doing, et cetera, but communications more leading the charge?
Yes, that's definitely important. I think a few ways we did that at Rockefeller. So one was within the communications team having portfolios and everyone assigned to particular initiatives. And that allowed them to build relationships with people on those teams, to be in regular contact with them, good two-way communication, hearing what those teams were up to, as well as communicating from our team. But there's a few different sort of models for how this can work at foundations, and I think sometimes it's even more delegated or diffuse than that, such that you have really communications people sitting just in each program team. And I think that can be challenging because then you don't really get the benefit of that coordination. So we had people who were very much part of the communications team, but they had their relationships and their portfolios. And then at a sort of broader strategic level, I sat on the executive team, which meant that I was sort of coordinating with my counterparts of program and operations. And I would also say that we had and have a board at Rockefeller that's very focused on communications and sees the value of that. And so I think that's both therefore reflected in the overall strategy of the organization, but that's also something that people hear and take note of when they're at board meetings, and they understand that that's important to the board and to leadership. And then I think it's also about communicating the successes that are being achieved through the influence work. I think we saw this with one team that was initially a little kind of skeptical of how much to engage around communications, really kind of helped put a plan for them together. They saw the impact for their work and then became champions internally. And of course, we made sure to help them be champions internally and to share that with their colleagues. And then others were like, well, can you do that for us as well, please? Can we have a foreign affairs supplement? So, yeah. Yes.
So about the 100 cities, I think, so you talk about funding to hire a chief resilience officer, and I think that is new to me. And I was surprised that in the list there are several Chinese cities. And I know China, like for organizations and the philanthropies, China is kind of sensitive to these. So I wonder what kind of difficulty or what procedure you go through to like engage with Chinese cities.
Yes, that's a very good question. So I mentioned that we set it up with 3 rounds of competitions, and we did that over 3 years. So we selected roughly 33 cities each year, and we had an open competition. Some cities applied 2 or 3 times. I think over 1,000 cities globally, totally. And that was a good communications vehicle because each of those competitions was news and word about 100 resilient cities, both when the competition launched and when the cities were chosen. But interestingly, because we very much wanted to be engaged and in China and have representation from Chinese cities, that was done a little bit differently, and we actually worked with the Chinese government to select those cities. So we kind of had a sort of a placeholder for some cities from China and worked with the Chinese government to identify those. Yes, yes, of course, yeah.
So still I'm really impressed by the projects you've done, like to make the resilience topic. But for me, I think it's not like a traditional like philanthropy project. And I feel there's a lot of design in it. So I wonder if is there a designer in your team, or like how much does design take part in this project?
Yes, I mean I think we really take and it's sort of what we call an initiative approach to the work at Rockefeller. And that's a little different from how a lot of foundations fund in a more kind of programmatic way. So what I mean by that is programmatically tends to be the sort of an area that the foundation is concerned or wants to support, whether it's education or health, say, and they will take sort of applications from nonprofits that are working in those areas, evaluate who has the best proposals, and give them funding, which is a perfectly good way to do philanthropy. The initiative model is more around creating the goal and the sort of the purpose of the initiative sort of within the foundation, but also drawing on outside talent as well, including designers, communications consultants to help with some of the work that we did. And so folks like IDEO came in to help us put some of these initiatives together, and then to identify grantees who are aligned with that goal and sort of bring them together as a group and fund them to do the work. So it does mean that the foundation is doing more of the sort of the upfront design work for the initiative. But as I said, normally we would be bringing in others to help do that. It's not done all by the program officers or the communications team, because trying to keep the staff of the foundation itself sort of relatively small and lean. Yeah.
I have two questions, if that's okay. One of which I think you started to address there, which is like this is all really comprehensive and cohesive, and the presentation, and I'm wondering how fully articulated that was at the outset of the campaign, and how much that was like a process of sort of discovery and elaborating as we went along. And then the second part is if I tend to wonder when I see successful campaigns like this, like, was there anything that just really didn't go the way you guys did?
So on the first question, no, it was certainly not fully articulated at the beginning. A lot of this was done through what we call the Influence Fund, which was actually a new funding stream that we set up right when I got to Rockefeller. And that was sort of a pretty new way of doing things in several ways. One example would be on the media grants. So a lot of foundations, or not a lot, but there are a number of foundations that fund media. The Ford Foundation, Knight Foundation, you probably heard a lot of them at the end of the PBS NewsHour or on NPR. And in many cases, that funding is because those foundations believe that media is a social good in a democratic society, and I think that is absolutely right. But the purpose of the Rockefeller media funding was much more as a tool towards a different programmatic goal, in this case, resilience. And so that was part of why the funding was done through the communications department and the communications team, which isn't at all usual either for a communications department to have a grant budget or for communications officers to be making those types of grants. And that's why when I mentioned the sort of the disclosure and the church-state divide, that was important, because we were cognizant that we're the same people who are also pitching stories to these outlets. That was something that we definitely worked on during my time there, and learned how to best engage with media on these types of grants. And to be honest, I would say over the 5 years I was there, the media changed as well in terms of their openness to grant funding and how they wanted to engage with foundations on these types of things. And then I think the part of the reason I referenced Sandy is that was not a planned or expected event. But it was one that we responded to and were able to use to build and develop the programming like Rebuild by Design and the impetus for 100 Resilient Cities. So we also, I think, needed to be able to respond to events and to move our programmatic strategy accordingly, which we did. In terms of things that,
This happened before, it's not you.
So, one example of that would be not all the cities that first were selected and joined are still in the network. I think over the 3 rounds, we got better at identifying what would make a city good. And we, I think, had like 2 or 3 dropouts, so I think it's actually a pretty good rate of failure. But that's certainly been a dynamic. So one example of that was we have Oakland, San Francisco, and Berkeley as sort of a group in the Bay Area working together. That's actually been very effective. But we also initially selected Alameda, and their application probably wasn't that strong, but we really liked the idea of this Bay Area cohort, so we included them. And then it became clear that really what they wanted to do was use the Chief Resilience Officer funding to basically sort of add capacity within the fire department. And so that was very different from what we were looking for them to do and what the other cities in the Bay Area were doing, and parted on perfectly good terms. I mean, I think that's one of the advantages of being a foundation. People normally not looking to cross you. There's always the hope of future funding. But it was certainly something from a communications perspective I was very aware of and involved in terms of like how would that be perceived. But I think it's actually a fine story to tell that not every city that comes in is going to be a perfect example. Yeah.
So what are you doing now? Or what was the reason for the transition, and how are you using what you were doing at Rockefeller even before in your current position or work?
So I have not been able to get away from Rockefeller entirely. I'm actually about to embark on a project with them to set up a Rockefeller Foundation alumni network, which is something that I advocated for us doing when I was there, and we never really kind of had the bandwidth to do it. So now I'm about to start work on that, which I think should be fun. But yeah, I wanted to be able to sort of take these types of techniques and experiences and be able to work with other organizations to do this type of funding, because I think we have seen a lot of interest from foundation peers around particularly the communications grant funding and how to do that effectively and how to do that well. So I feel like there's a sort of a niche there, and it would be I think fun to be able to do it with a broader group of organizations. Yeah. Yes.
How do you guys measure the impact of these different communication strategies?
Yes, good question. So I think communications is certainly a hard thing to measure, but we were committed to trying. The way we set it up was a sort of a three-step process that we saw most of the work that we were doing fitting into. So the first step we defined as sort of reaching out. It's that media, social engagement, this is an important issue, you should care about it. And we were doing that in a targeted way. It was normally business leaders, political leaders, opinion leaders that we were seeking to influence. And that reaching out stage, that's the one that's relatively easy to measure. You have your social media impressions, you have your media hits, you can kind of get a sense of whether you are reaching people and who you are reaching. The second stage we defined as sort of changing attitudes, and there we were looking to see, are we starting to make those decision makers, those business, political, opinion leaders think differently about this issue? And that type of analysis we really did more through looking at speeches, op-eds, public pronouncements. It's harder to do that in a truly comprehensive way, so we had to be sort of somewhat targeted about where and who we were analyzing. And then the third area is changing behavior, because that's ultimately what we were looking to do. And there we were looking for things like policy change, governments responding to the need for resilience in terms of their personnel structure, or their including resilience in their planning. We would also measure that through financial commitments, whether that's a government budget or the private sector putting funding in, or changes in business practices would be another thing that we would look at. And so those, I think, what's harder there is that you don't normally have a huge number of those, but also at that point, attribution gets kind of hard. I mean, we weren't the only people working in the resilience space. So is a commitment of funding solely due to Rockefeller Foundation's work? Probably not. And how do you parse out how much? At that point, it's really, I think, impossible to truly answer those questions. So you just have to be comfortable with a sense that if you follow through those three areas, there was ultimate change in people's behavior and practices, and we feel that we were sufficiently involved that part of that was due to our work. Yes.
I wonder, do you think it's easier for you as a founder to communicate with organizations, or how, like, because I wonder how an organization communicate founder and make you feel like, okay, I want to fund them, like.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no doubt that it's much easier to communicate, both, I would say, because, I mean, I talked about sort of building up the brand and the influence of Rockefeller around resilience, but we were starting from a 100-year legacy brand, so that was very beneficial. And then, of course, I also mentioned the funding that we're able to provide, and when you're a funder, that undoubtedly opens doors and makes people much more willing to have conversations with you. So I don't want to suggest that for an organization that's either a smaller foundation or a nonprofit, that it would be easy to just replicate what we as the Rockefeller Foundation did. However, I do think that some of these tools can be applied. And I mentioned, you don't have to have a cash endowment to have an influence endowment. I think any organization can be thinking about their brand, their networks, their convening power, and how to build those up. I mean, in the introduction, as mentioned, I'm president of the board of the Stonewall Community Foundation. So that's an organization that's also a foundation, but we are raising money as well as giving out grants. And that's a place where I think there's a brand that comes from the Stonewall name and the history that has that we've been able to leverage and use to benefit the organization, and that comes from a larger brand beyond just the work of the foundation specifically. Sure. Okay, thank you.